Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Priscilla Chigariro and this is Glam in Vintage. We are at chapter 2 now of the story of my marriage. So if you are new, please go back and watch chapter 1, parts 1 and 2 before you start watching this chapter so that it all makes sense. And please, whilst you are here, please subscribe, and if you haven't already and you've been watching my videos, please subscribe. That way at least you know that you will catch every single chapter as I upload them and you won't miss a single thing. The reason why I would like people to subscribe and to share this story is because my hope is that it will help someone out there. There are a lot of people that go through things and keep them to themselves, so they feel isolated and very lonely. Hearing someone else tell their story sometimes helps to not only give you the confidence to continue, but then to also, it can inspire you to actually do something about what's happening to you and to change your story, to take control of what's happening to you. And also this, I hope, will be informative for people that are going through what I went through. I will be able to share some resources that I used because unfortunately for me, I didn't know where to begin when half of this stuff happened to me. And you will see now in this new chapter that we're going to begin all of the crazy things that happened and I had no idea what to do. So I hope that this can help someone, even if it's one person. That is more than what I would hope for. Thank you so much, and I will see you in a minute and we can dive straight into chapter 2 of the story of my marriage. From where we left off last time, I got on a plane and I went to Russia with this resolve that this marriage was over. I had told him and I was determined to stick to that. There was nothing that was going to change my mind or the course of what was going to happen. I was adamant, and for sure, I had definitely had enough. So I arrived in Moscow the following months. It was September, October. He tried to negotiate with me, offered me lots of different scenarios, all with us remaining married, but we could have an open marriage. He could live here, I could live there, etc. But for me, that wasn't an option. The thought and the idea of continuing to be married to this man was what I didn't want. I didn't want any kind of association with him. I didn't want anyone to think that I was still with him. Because throughout the marriage, one thing that I left out in chapter 1 was he made me end up with no friends, basically. He would sort of befriend my friends, and if they were male friends, I would suddenly not be allowed to speak to them anymore, even if it was for business purposes or anything like that. So he would come in and take over my friends. And then if it were couples or things like that, eventually he would terrorize people to the extent where a friend of mine even wrote to me and said to me, you know what, Priscilla, I'm so sorry, but you're just collateral damage. This man is so awful that my husband and I cannot associate with you too. And I completely understood it. I didn't blame anyone for not wanting to be around him, because I myself also didn't want to be around him. So none of the things that he offered me were attractive, and none of them, I didn't even consider a single one of them. For me, my thought was our daughter would be born, we would figure out where we would live, because I never wanted my children to be without their father. I would live somewhere close by, or we would live in the same countries to make it easy for us to be able to share custody and for each of us to just go our separate ways and live our lives. That for me was the goal. So I shared this with him, and then he said, okay, fine, we can start thinking of which countries we would want to live in, because neither of us really wanted to continue to live in Russia. And I wasn't particularly adamant on living in Zimbabwe. I had been living sort of in and out of Zimbabwe for such a long time. I actually enjoyed it. So I didn't mind. I just wanted to live somewhere where it was English speaking so that I wouldn't have the limitations that I'd faced living in Russia. So we debated that over those months. And then in November, our daughter was finally born on November 15th. She was perfect, beautiful, but the surrogacy process was just crazy. I wasn't allowed to be there for the birth, as you are allowed to be in other countries. I also wasn't even allowed to see her on the first day. This totally broke my heart. I remember like crying from the moment that I heard that the surrogate was in labor and being told, no, I'm not allowed to come to the hospital. It was just heartbreaking. So the following day, they allowed us to come and see her. So we went, saw her for the first time. She was just perfect. But then we weren't allowed to take her home. I think that was like on a Friday. So she stayed there the whole weekend, Saturday, Sunday. And then we were supposed to be allowed to take her home on Monday. Sunday night, the day before we went to pick her up, we had an argument. And he got so angry with me, he jumped on me. I was sitting on the couch in the living room. He jumped on me and kind of like pressed my head down, and then he punched me on my eye. Our son walked in like at that moment, and he was like, what's going on, what's going on? And then he started pretending we were playing, that he was tickling me. And I was just like, because I was crying. He was like, no, mama's just laughing. I was just tickling her. So he got off me, and then he picked up our son, went to another room, and I got up and I went into my closet and closed the door and stayed in there so that he wouldn't see me. So the next day, I woke up with a black eye, of course, and we went to the hospital to pick up our daughter. When we got there, the doctor asked what happened to me. She was like, oh, what happened to your eye? And he jumped in. He was like, oh, she's been crying the whole weekend because you wouldn't let her take her daughter home on Friday. I just looked at him and I kept quiet. The one thing that I regretted, or that I regret now, is I couldn't take pictures that day because it just looked so bad. Me holding this baby with this black eye. I mean, how would I explain that to anybody who saw those pictures in the future? So I didn't take any pictures. I just took pictures of her only, and of her brother holding her. Those are the only pictures that I have and posted. My family came to see her, to meet her. So, and they came and stayed for Christmas as well because we couldn't travel. The process in Russia, when you do surrogacy, the surrogate has to renounce being a parent, and then you are given the parenthood as the new parents. But my ex and I were never married legally. Like, we never had a white wedding or never had anything signed to say that we were legally married. So according to Russian authorities, we were actually not married. So in that case, we had to go through this long court case in order to be able to get her birth certificate. And at the beginning, the lawyers told us it would take about 3 months, but it ended up taking close to a year. So this whole thing started. My family came to Russia. We had a wonderful Christmas. He was barely there. I hadn't told my father yet that we were no longer together because we were living in the same apartment, but he had his room, I had my room. It was a fairly large apartment, so we could split. I didn't even really see him, but we were both there so that we could both spend time with the kids. And yeah, we were still kind of not open about what was going on with everybody yet. So Christmas went by, January came by, and we were now kind of discussing the logistics and like really considering which countries to go to, etc. And I kind of felt like we were on the same page. You know, he had been through his like craziness of like the begging, the slightly like, you know, going off the rails, etc. And I thought that he was like past this now. We were now at a stage where we could actually like logically discuss things and decide what we were going to do going forward, because we still had shared business interests in Zimbabwe, and I was still managing those and he was still contributing because he helped with the management sometimes, but mostly it was me. But yeah, we had grown one of the businesses together and then the rest were just mine. So we had that in common, and I had no intention of like branching off on my own or anything like that. I just thought, you know what, we have children together. These businesses are going to benefit our children and they'll continue to pay for our lifestyle in Zimbabwe. There'll be no need to actually get money from anywhere else because these businesses were actually doing really well. So January came by. At the end of January, I suddenly got this message from a girl, a Russian girl. She sent me an enormously long message telling me what had been happening for the past 2 years. Every time I would leave Russia, what would happen in my apartment. She was apparently his girlfriend, and they had had some kind of fight. So she decided to contact me and tell me all of these things. So she told me everything that had been happening with lots of proof and evidence. And then she told me that that December, whilst my family was here, because we had actually gone out of the city because I wanted to show my family the Russian countryside, and he hadn't come. He had said that he would stay in Moscow because he had work. So she said, gave me the exact date. She said to me on that day, he had invited her and 2 of his friends, another couple, to our apartment where I was living with the kids and him. And they had a big party. They had some kind of agreement, ended up having a fight in the apartment. He apparently ripped off her earring, so she started bleeding, and she was pissed and upset about it and left the apartment, etc. And I guess they never made up or fixed what happened. That's this message to me. So I thought back to that time, and actually when I got back from the countryside, thankfully I was the first person that came into that walked into the house, because I walked in, I found the door to his bedroom open. I looked in, he was sleeping. There was like a lot of stuff lying around that was not great. So I picked up stuff, put it in his cupboard, closed the door, and then I closed the door to his room. But he was like out cold, so I knew that he was not going to wake up or anything like that. So closed the door, walked around the rest of the apartment, picked up glasses, tidied up things, went into my children's room, and then I found a tissue with blood on it on the changing station. Gross, but I picked it up. I threw it away, tidied up everything before people got out of the cars to come upstairs. So by the time my father came upstairs and my sister and her kids, like everything looked fine. I told my dad that he was at work, that he wasn't there. We had dinner, he still didn't wake up, and then everybody went to bed. He woke up much later. I didn't say anything because, you know, I didn't care. And I just did not think that he would have been so forward as to bring another woman into our apartment whilst I was in the country. So that never occurred to me. Anyway, so after this girl told me all of this, I was just pissed. I was like, okay, you know, it's one thing to see someone when you are, and not bring them into our home where our children live, where I live. And whilst my family is there, you do this. It's just completely disrespectful. So the next day when I saw him, I told him that was it. He needed to pack, he needed to go somewhere else, but he couldn't continue to stay with us in the apartment. He could come and see the kids whenever he wanted. That didn't even matter, but then he couldn't stay there anymore. So obviously he resisted, but then eventually, yeah, we had a little fight about it and he left. He took all his things and he went and stayed with his mom for a little while, then found his own place and then whatever. Around the same time, at the end of February, my visa for my stay in Russia was expiring at the end of March. So I left, I went to Zimbabwe, and I went with our son. Ordinarily, my son and I would renew our visas in Zimbabwe because it was much easier to renew with the Zimbabwean passport rather than to use my son's American passport. But then this time, my ex was like, no, you just go and renew yours because my employer has decided to sponsor our son's visa along with mine, and they will give us 2-year visas instead of 1 year. This sounded odd to me, but then like for some reason, I just didn't like think about it too much. I was like, okay, it's fine. We'll get 2-year, he can get a 2-year visa and then I will just continue to renew mine annually. So I went to Zimbabwe and then I went with our son, and then he came whilst I was there just like 2 days before I left to go back to Russia, because our daughter was there. Since she couldn't travel because she didn't have any documents, she had stayed with the nanny and his mom. So those 2 days that we were together, he was supposed to stay a little bit longer with our son and then come with him to Russia so that he would go back to school. He would be able to go back to second term of school. So I went back quickly. And then when I arrived, I think 2 days later, he told me that he was not coming back when he was supposed to come back. I asked him why. I was like, you know, our son needs to go to school. School starts like in 2 or 3 days. And he was like, he's not going back to that school. And I'm like, why? He's like, oh, he doesn't think that he's learning anything. So he has decided that he should be homeschooled. So he just pulled him out of school. Obviously, this was like, I was like, that's ridiculous. But then there was nothing I could do then because the school was super expensive. I couldn't just go off and pay the fees. And so I was like, okay, fine. They got back to Russia, and the homeschooling consisted of his mother teaching our son every day, taking him to museums. And this lasted for like the first week. The second week, it started becoming my burden. I had to take him to his extracurricular activities that he had booked him into, chess and tennis, etc. And I had a she wasn't even 5 months old. She was like, what, 3 months old at the time, 3-4 months old. And I had to take care of her. And now I had this extra burden of having a 5-year-old who's out of school when you're not sleeping the whole night because you have a baby. It was just ridiculous. And I told him, you know what, in the afternoon when he should be at school, she's trying to sleep, but he wants to play and he's making noise and she can't sleep. It's just complete chaos in this house. Like, what is your plan? Like, what are we doing? You know, something has to happen, or else I'm going to be forced to step in and make a plan. So tell me what is happening. He didn't say anything. At the end of March, just before my son's visa expired, he started exhibiting some very strange signs. Like, he started like talking a little crazy, like what sounded like crazy to me. He started suggesting all these things like, oh, you know, since we are separating, why don't you stay with the baby and you raise her, and then I go with our son and I raise him separately? And I was like, no. Why would I ever even consider that? Number one, separating the children, and number two, me separating myself from my son. And you know, he's so used to being with me, and I don't even need to make excuses. Why would anyone want to separate children from their other parent? So I said, no, obviously not. So this visa situation came up, and unbeknownst to me, He took our son, flew to Dubai. I only found out about it when they were at the airport boarding the flight. I called the police. They told me that there was nothing that they could do. This is in Russia. There's nothing that they could do because this was his father. He was free to take him in and out of the country as he pleased. So there was nothing I could do. I panicked. I contacted my sister. I contacted the State Department, etc. Tried to do as much as I could to no avail. So they were gone for 3 weeks, in which time he had already initiated the renewal of my son's visa in his American passport. So he got this American passport. They just traveled. They went to Dubai, they went to Malaysia, they went all over the place during that time. And I was in Moscow completely panicking, begging him to come back, not knowing what to do, not even knowing where to begin. But thankfully, after those 3 weeks, he came back. And when he came back, he gave me the passports, he gave me everything, like trying to buy back my trust. Gave me everything, told me that he would never take him away permanently. It's something that he would never do. He had only done this because his visa was expiring and I was refusing to be cooperative, apparently. So I said, okay, I took all the documents back. And of course, you know, I was like, okay, never again. I'm never going to give him this again. I'm never going to give him the ability to do anything similar to this again. And this was in April. May went by, things were fine. We were continuing to discuss logistics, and now, you know, our households were completely separated, and he had cut back on the money that he was giving us for survival. He had started at a certain amount every month, and then in March he reduced it. And I felt like he was trying to pressure me, like financially, into kind of giving in to a lot of the things that he wanted, or to maybe reconsidering, you know, staying in this marriage. So he kept reducing the amounts of money that he would give us up, and then there was a certain car service that we used, like Uber. He canceled that, and we had to use like cheaper, like taxis, just like off the street taxis. And I was like, okay. So in May, I just went to the bank and I withdrew as much money as I could in cash. I withdrew it, and then I kept it in the house. He found out the next day, obviously. And then he had my access to the bank accounts canceled. I didn't care because I had enough money that would last me at least for another 2 to 3 months. He was obviously pissed, but then at the same time, he was like, oh, well, it's money that you're gonna have to use anyway on the family. And I was like, obviously, what else do you think I was going to use it for? So May went by, then June came. I hadn't been going to Zim a lot. I had sort of been managing the businesses very remotely because of the situation with my daughter, because she couldn't travel, and because she was so small. I didn't want to leave her behind for a very long time. Just so that you understand the business structure. I met my ex in 2011. I had already been running the Fashion Week for 2 years. It was basically 3 years before we got married. I started it in 2009. So this was something that I had already done for myself, which I had already built for myself. I had already established a reputation for myself in the business industry, in the fashion industry. I already had all of that set. And then when I started my restaurant, The Space, he specifically did not want to fund it, because he said that the money that he gave me was not for me to start businesses. It was for me to spend buying other things. He preferred for me to go to Gucci, buy the whole store, rather than to make substantial investments, things that would grow, that would make me independent. He didn't want that. So every single time he knew that Fashion Week was coming around, or I was in the process of starting a business, he would stop giving me money, which would mean that I would have to fund it myself. So he did not contribute to the creation of the space. I started it really, really small, in a very small house in ch2.pt because of that specific reason, because I didn't have the money to actually start off like with a bang. I like designed the furniture myself. I got the furniture made in Mbare and in Glenview. I went to all of those places and these artisans made the furniture for me. So the startup cost was very, very low. It was just my rent, which I had to get every single month. And like we struggled and built this business with my GM at the time, Marshall, who really helped me a lot. We went through all of this, like not having money, etc., because he 100% did not want to contribute financially to the business. We started a taxi business as well. It was something that he and I spoke about a lot because we did travel a lot, and with every country that we went to, there was always like Uber and stuff like that to pick you up from the airport. But coming to Harare was another thing, because then you would have to find someone to pick you up, etc. So we were like, you know what, why don't we set up a business, like an Uber style business, where we can just, you know, book a car and it can come pick us up. And we did. So this was G-Taxi. So G-Taxi was running. He was more involved in that than I was, although I did do a lot of the day-to-day. I did all of the major meetings with like your embassies. The American embassy was a client, the British embassy. We had a ton of the embassy. The business was doing really well, and I did all the legwork for that. And I also managed to run my own business on the side. I started my shoe business as well. And yeah, I slowly built up these little businesses, which he didn't take seriously. He actually didn't even really care. He would come, obviously, when he was in town to the restaurants and stuff, but then it wasn't anything that he looked at as being serious. Until one day, a friend of his went to my restaurant, and randomly when they were having a conversation, his friend told him, oh, you know, I went to this really cute little place in Chizzy, it's called The Space, you know, it's like new, they've got really great shisha, etc. And then he was like, oh, that's my wife's restaurant. Only then he started taking me seriously, started looking at it like it was a proper business, etc. So when we moved, when we in 2017 bought our property in Ballantyne Park, then he actually invested some money in me doing the developments to the property that were necessary for me to be able to make the restaurant a much bigger business. So that was the only time that he did that. So at this time now, during our period of uncertainty, I was running the businesses, he was contributing to the management of them, and in June, my GM suddenly resigned. His resignation was so sudden, and it sort of left things a little chaotic. My head of finance at the time called me and said, Priscilla, no, you need to come. You need to come and help us stabilize things and possibly hire a new person, etc. So I told him I needed to go back to Zimbabwe for a couple of days so that I could resolve this issue, and I would be back. And just before I left, he came to me. He was being all nice. You know, he had been really, really, really nice to me since he came back from Malaysia after he had just taken our son. He was being very, very nice to me. Yes, he had been like, you know, very tight with the money, but we were at a stage where things were kind of calm. I felt that like the waters were calm. I felt like, you know, we were sort of headed in the same direction. He was not being mean, nothing. So he came to me and he was like, oh, he would like to take the children to St. Petersburg, which is in Russia. It's another city, second city in Russia, whilst I am away. He'll just take them for the weekend. Please, could he have their travel documents? And I gave him our son's passport, and I gave him our daughter's birth record. because he would need that in order to travel with her. I never in my wildest dreams thought that he would do it again. He had been so sincere when he had told me that he would never try to take any of the children away from me or to separate us or anything like that. And you know, like, keep in mind, like, up until this stage, he hadn't really acted like completely crazy. Yes, he took our son for 3 weeks, but he brought him back. So nothing unusual had happened. So I gave them to him, got on a plane, went to Zimbabwe, did my business, and then I was supposed to fly back on the Sunday. I left like on a Thursday. I was supposed to fly back on the Sunday, but I went to the airport and they said no, they didn't have a ticket for me to fly on Sunday. I called him like, what's up? Like, dude, I told you I want to fly back on Sunday. And then he was like, oh, he made a mistake. He booked my flight for Monday. So I was like, fine. Went back home. Monday, got on my flight back to Russia. Flew, you know, your phone is off. You don't know what's going on. I landed in Russia early morning. I was probably around, like, the flight lands around 6 a.m. I got out, did my usual routine, got off the plane. Whilst I was in the queue, the immigration queue, it takes forever, it's really long. So that's where I would usually change my SIM cards and start calling my car so that it can come to the airport, so that I can sort of synchronize my exit from the airport with my car arriving. So I did all of that, put in my SIM card and stuff, and by that time that happened, I was at the immigration desk. So I just put my phone away and, you know, went through immigration, went to the baggage to collect my luggage. When I got there, I was like, okay, you know what? It's now time for me to book my car. I take my phone out and there's like a ton of messages, WhatsApps. I was like, what's going on? And they're mostly from my ex. I opened WhatsApp. It is hard to describe the feeling that I had at that moment. I felt like my whole world, as I knew it, collapsed. The first message he had written was, "We have left Russia. I have taken our son and we are going to America. He's going to see some doctors and he's going to find him a school there. They're not coming back." And then he went on and on, talking about absolutely nothing useful. I couldn't even read it because my eyes were blurred, like the tears just started streaming down my face. I had to go to the bathroom in the airport. Like I actually think I threw up. Like I couldn't believe what was happening. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to start. But then something deep within me, I knew that this was it. I knew that he was not lying. I knew that my whole world, my whole life, everything that I had thought, everything that I had planned was over. It was over in that one second. I started messaging him, like, where are you? What's going on? Like, you can't do this. Like, what's going on? He ignored my messages at the beginning, and then I started phoning, and then eventually he picked up, acting as if nothing crazy or strange was happening. He told me that they were in Rome. They were having a layover, but they were going to Boston. And he would call me then. I asked to speak to my son. He said no. He said he's sleeping. When he wakes up, then we'll call you then. And I asked him why he was doing this. And then he was like, oh, you know what? We can talk about that later, but then it's not like you're never gonna see him again. You can just come to Boston if you wanna see him. And obviously he knew that there was no way I was leaving Russia anytime soon, because our daughter had no documents and he had just left her incidentally in the countryside in his grandmother's cottage. I got into my car and drove to Moscow. On my way there, I started calling the State Department. That was useless. I called the American Embassy. They hadn't opened yet. And then I called my sister in Harare and I told her what was happening. I told her to go to the American Embassy there to try to figure out what we could do, what could be done. And then I called my nanny who had my baby, and she told me that she had been left in the countryside. And I said to her, like, what happened? Like, why were you not, you know, with my son? Like, why didn't you like say something? Why didn't you? And she was like, oh, they just told me that they were going away somewhere and they would come back. And I'm like, someone leaves you in the middle of nowhere, takes one child and tells you that they're flying away to Italy, and you don't think to tell the mother? I was so pissed. Anyway, so I booked her a car. She came back into Moscow, met me at the apartment. When I arrived at the apartment, it was basically like, you know, like, in hindsight, I don't know sometimes how I don't know how I am here, how I managed to keep it all together and to do everything to manage all of these situations.